So I would like to start this talk by first mentioning some of the people who came before me and those who have helped me with my work on the Proto Elamite tablets. This is not just an empty exercise in name dropping, but is intended to show how progress on Proto Elamite has been made and where progress will likely come from in the future. First, and most importantly, is of course Bob Englund, whose work on Proto Elamite represented a step change in the study of that writing system. Bob Englund was, of course, the world's leading expert on the proto-cuneiform texts, the earliest texts from Mesopotamia, and it was exactly his knowledge of the early texts from Mesopotamia that enabled him to fundamentally change the study of Proto Elamite. But Englund's work, and my own, is also immensely indebted to the work of Peter Damerow and Göran Friberg, two historians of mathematics who worked with the numerical systems in the archaic texts, and following the Russian scholar Weimann, showed how these early texts used content-specific numerical systems. In fact, Friberg's decipherment of many Proto-Elamite texts in his early roots of Babylonian mathematics still stands today. And Damerow's and Englund's masterful treatment of the Yaya text show how further progress could be made. When I joined the work on Proto Elamite, it was realized that we needed an electronic corpus to make any new progress. And Bob Englund tasked me with putting this together when I was still a graduate student at UCLA. One of the most surprising facts of this early work was that the published data set was very polluted, and that the copies simply were not reliable. We realized, therefore, that no further improvement was possible before the texts could be studied again. And the next person that I need to mention is therefore Beatrice André Salvini. The news reached us barely 2 weeks ago of Beatrice's untimely death. So I wish to take this moment and praise her for her significant support for open access to the Louvre collections and for her support of research on Proto Elamite. I went to the Louvre for the first time in 2001 and quickly was able to improve the readings of large numbers of tablets after Beatrice gave me unlimited access to the collection. Over the following decade, Bob Englund and I remained in conversation with Beatrice André Salvini about the digitization of the Proto Elamite and the cuneiform collections in the Louvre. And this was successful in 2013, when we signed an agreement that resulted in a complete corpus of Proto Elamite and large amounts of the cuneiform tablets there being digitized for web. But I should also mention Jepael Nokande, who in an equal way personally moved to remove barriers to research and concluded an agreement with the CTLI to digitize and disseminate online all of the Proto Elamite and cuneiform tablets in the National Museum of Iran. I'd like to very briefly, of course, also thank Simin Piran, curator of the tablet collection at the National Museum of Iran, Parsa Daneshman, my former PhD student, and Sepide Yagane, an MPhil student from Tehran, who all have worked tirelessly for the digitization of the collections in Tehran. But let me start by introducing very briefly the Cuneiform Digital Library Initiative to you. The CTLI is today one of the longest lasting and most successful digital humanities projects anywhere in the world. Online since 2000 and building on the foundations led by the Uruk project of the Free University Berlin and the Max Planck Institute, also Berlin, the CTLI has continued to make the form and content of cuneiform tablets available to scholars everywhere in the world. When I was a postdoc in Germany working on the CTLI, I was once at a workshop in Berlin where a scholar from CERN, the European Organization for Nuclear Research, was also present. I was lucky enough to end up at the same table for lunch as this scientist, and we engaged in the usual small talk of conference breaks. Back then, I was deeply engaged in the digitization of cuneiform collections, and when he learned what I was doing, he praised the effort and reminded me that one of the most important reasons why we, the Archaeologists, should be the ones digitizing the cuneiform tablets was that otherwise Google would do it at some point, and they would be setting the standards and not us. So this is, I think, a powerful reminder of the importance of the work we do to digitize cuneiform and Proto-Elamite tablets. We don't just make them available. We decide in what format and what data to make available. And we believe we're better at that than, for example, Google. Now, some of us are, and some of us are maybe not. Some projects allow you to only access that data through a very specific web interface with drop-down menus and defined search fields. Of course, it's very difficult to create a fuzzy search or to guess what anyone may wish to ask of the data. But I think that if you don't believe that you have all the answers, and therefore also don't think you know all the questions that could ever be asked of your corpus, then you must make it available in ways that allows others to ask their own questions of the data. And that is why we always make all of our raw data available for download as well as on the online interface. So what are the goals of the CTLI? Well, they are simply put to create a permanent and sustainable virtual archive of the form and content of all cuneiform and protolamide for the permanent safeguarding of this unique shared cultural heritage. And we're doing that by firstly creating a catalog of all cuneiform inscriptions with associated metadata, that is transliterations and translations, and secondly, by capturing images of the text artifacts. And we aim at producing images of a sufficient quality to improve on the catalog and the metadata. We hope that this will also be a resource for national and international policing agencies combating the destruction and theft of cultural heritage objects. A further goal of the CTLI is to enable access to that archive through a powerful search engine, and thereby to enable new research on cuneiform and protolamide by both specialists, scholars from related disciplines, and informal learners through open access. We don't think we have all the questions. Therefore, we do not dictate how you ask questions of our dataset. You may have different research questions than I do, and I'm very happy with that. And then we wish to, of course, generate new corpus-based tools for archaeology, replacing century-years-old sign lists and outdated lexicographical and linguistic studies. I think that any of you who have tried to learn cuneiform will agree with me that having to struggle to get hold of a French or German language sign list on paper is not the best way to study in 2020. And finally, we wish to build educational tools for both formal and informal learners through both wiki-style pages and educational partnerships, tablet computer apps, and more. It was, of course, clear to me from very early on in my work on Proto Elamite that access to images of the tablets in Tehran was very important for any decipherment to progress. What I didn't know, and I'll mention this a little later, was that there were still good numbers of unpublished tablets from the old excavations in Susa, present in Tehran. The publication by Shale in MTP 26 of the circa 500 Proto Elamite tablets, presumably from the excavations led by Roland de Mecanem, was obviously also the worst of the old paper publications, perhaps except for de Mecanem's own publication in Revue Archaeologie 50. The copies of the MTP 26 tablets were prepared by Roland de Mecanem's daughter using a chambre claire. A chambre claire is a mechanical device used to project an image of the object onto another surface, and it was used for copying inscriptions. I therefore decided early on not to base any important observations solely on information from tablets published in MTP 26, although this meant excluding about a third of the corpus. And I mentioned on numerous occasions my interest in helping making the collections in Tehran accessible to scholars worldwide, but it was not before 2016 that the conversations became serious. And in 2017 to 2018, we were able to begin work in Tehran, digitizing first the Prodolamide tablets and later the cuneiform tablets as well. And we have produced a collections page on the CTLI for the National Museum of Iran, next to the pages for the Louvre, the British Museum, Fort Asiatic Museum in Berlin, and so forth. The page is currently bilingual Farsi and English, but can be expanded to, for example, German as well. It includes an introduction to the collection, partly written by Simin Piran and partly based on the introduction in Jebrail Nokande's recent book on the National Museum of Iran collections. And it gives various ways of looking at the tablets of the collection. sorted by time period or by genre. This can be expanded in the future to include, for example, a list of find spots and so forth. The individual pages of the collection presents in the center the lead image, currently either an image produced from the flatbed scans, images mostly by Parser Danelsman, or a scan image of the old hand copy of mentioned shale. Eventually, we hope that we can here present several generations of images of the tablets, highlighting various aspects of the object. On the left is the catalog information, and on the right, the transcription. We are adding translations of text as well, but that is time-consuming and not always very useful. Most importantly, for research is the possibility to now search in collections stored in different locations. Anyone working on Proto Elamite has to consult tablets split between the Louvre in France and the National Museum in Iran in Tehran. But they can now look at both collections together online. But what are the main obstacles to this open flow of information in the humanities? I see two such main obstacles that nevertheless intertwine, as the one is often used as an excuse for the other. Firstly, there is what I call the cartelizing of scholarships. Groups of scholars who restrict access to collections of ancient documents for as long as possible, slowly releasing bits and pieces into the public space against the promise of continued state funding. And secondly, the politicizing of scholarship, which is often used as a pretext of the cartels mentioned before. In allowing free and unfettered digital access to their collections of Proto Elamite and cuneiform tablets, the Louvre and the National Museum of Tehran have truly initiated a step change in the study of the ancient cultures of Mesopotamia and Iran. But why did we start to write? We may not be able to give ever a universal answer to this question, but in ancient Mesopotamia and in ancient Iran, the answer is clear and unambiguous. Writing was invented through a process of increasingly complex systems of accounting and shared a common background with arithmetics. There is no evidence that early Mesopotamian or early Mayan writing was invented to convey anything but information about assets and the movement of assets within very restricted economic units. Proto-cuneiform, the Iranian Proto-Elamite, had a very restricted use. Writing was employed only for bookkeeping and never for display inscriptions or even on seals. The occasional spillover into seals of single signs is a feature of the fluid nature of the signery, where some signs were both emblems and signs in the writing system, and not a symptom of a broader use of writing. Iran holds a special place in the history of the invention of writing, with more inventions of writing systems than most places. Although Proto-Elamite is clearly inspired by the older proto-cuneiform from Mesopotamia, and I shall return to this, it is nevertheless a very independent usage of writing. Later scribes used Sumerian and Akkadian cuneiform and adapted cuneiform to write Elamite. Scribes in Susa also invented a short-lived pseudo-writing system at the end of the 3rd millennium, and of course, we all know about the invention of Old Persian cuneiform in the second half of the 1st millennium BC. Perhaps because of these many script inventions, scholars from the related field of archaeology have frequently publicized claims of yet other writing systems, such as these fantastical claims about a geometrical writing system from the Giroth area. The interesting claims surrounding the discovery of these objects aside, no specialist of writing anywhere in the world, let alone any Assyriologist, would ever entertain the notion that these pieces represent a writing system. With such claims, we really are in Rudy Giuliani territory. Should they prove genuine ancient objects, they are something different, doodles, shamanistic sign sequences, or the like, and that too would be very interesting. Perhaps even more interesting than another inscription repeating the drab claims of a local ruler. Similarly, with the so-called linear Elamite inscriptions that may or may not be decipherable, scholars, often with less training in ancient scripts than could be wished for, consider a linguistic decipherment more desirable than understanding the many features of this script that clearly puts it aside from other scripts, features that suggest It was never a much-used script and probably not long-lived. The random order of the direction of reading, the uneven execution of similar signs, the disparity between the signaries of text on various parts, and so forth, all points in this direction. Arguably a much more interesting understanding than another reading of a ruler name, his god, and the poor people he murdered or maimed on campaign. So what is Proto Elamite? Well, first, it is important to note that the name Proto Elamite is simply just a construction of Vincent Shale, who believed the Elamites to have had their own writing system, Elamite, while speaking Ancient. This, of course, has turned out to be incorrect. The Elamites wrote in cuneiform, and today we call their language Elamite. Whether that's correct or not is a different question. Ethnic groups don't invent writing systems that fit their languages. This is an anachronism. Sure enough, there are examples of this in the past few hundred years when writing systems have been invented for Cherokee and similar, but that's not how it worked in the past. Proto-Elamite was largely loaned from Proto-Cuneiform and then developed independently to a certain extent before disappearing. Proto-Elamite does not basically convey spoken language. It is not a communicative system. This is not only clear from the structure of the text, but also from the fact that the signary was never standardized. Judging from the complexity of the Susa texts, the scale of the economy recorded in the Susa text, and the proven dependency of Proto-Elamite on Mesopotamian Proto-Cuneiform and Susa's proximity to southern Mesopotamia, Proto-Elamite was probably invented at Susa. The Proto-Elamite corpus is large compared to other undeciphered and early corpora, with more than 1,600 texts and fragments found at Susa, maybe even 1,700 now alone. The corpus today consists of more than 10,000 lines of texts. So let us look at what we know. Except for two possible metro-mathematical texts and one possible lexical text, all of the Proto-Elamite tablets are administrative. This is interesting and can be compared to the situation at Uruk, where during the contemporary late Uruk period, where something like 15% of all texts were lexical. The content of the texts is exclusively related to agricultural production and the storage and distribution of agricultural products, to labor administration, and to animal herding. The administration documented in the texts appears to relate to relatively modest households with a maximum of 100 dependent workers. The Proto-Elamite tablets do not mention any of Iran's traditional exports, stone, wood, metal, and so forth, that feature so prominently in the early texts from Mesopotamia. But this should not come as a surprise to us, as these sorts of materials were probably not traded in ways that will be recorded in state administrative documents during this period, but procured during raids, given as gifts, and in similar ways. The purpose of the two metro-mathematical texts is unclear. One, MTP 26362 is in the National Museum in Tehran, and the copy is fairly difficult to use. The other, MTP 17328, shown here, is fragmentary. The doodle found on the reverse of this text is similar to doodles found on archaic texts from Ur in southern Mesopotamia, dating to around 2800 BC, and school texts from the Farah period, dating to 2700 BC. And it is similar to the scribal designs that are found on Proto-Elamite administrative texts. But there, on the Proto-Elamite administrative texts, the designs can be conclusively shown to function similar to seals. The identification of this text, MTP 2671, as a lexical text is by no means certain. I'm very happy that I think Catherine Kelly, my former student, is present at this meeting, who is the one who made this proposal, and I'm quite intrigued by the suggestion. It remains our best candidate. The suggestion is made because every single entry has a one sign, which is then totaled on the reverse, which is similar to a lexical test from early Mesopotamia. There's also exceedingly little repetition between the entries. I shall return to the question of the missing lexical tradition later when discussing the possible reasons for the death of Proto Elamite. One of the strangest features of Proto Elamite, of the Proto Elamite writing system, is the absence of signs depicting the human body or parts thereof. Although this has not received much attention, it is one of the main obstacles for decipherment. In other writing systems, signs such as hand, a head, a mouth have given vital clues for decipherment. And in the absence of those signs, we have to rely on other methods. The apparent taboo is not restricted to the writing system, but seems to permeate the Proto-Elamite culture. And we find no representations of humans in Proto-Elamite art, glyphic, or plastic. However, we are only humans, and we do like to anthropomorphize the world around us. We see a face in the clouds and in rock formations in the mountains. Similarly, some Proto-Elamite seals have been reconstructed with humanoid figures. In the words of Léon Legrand, the seal on the slide here depicts, and I quote, a pastoral scene with 2 large bulls and a goat. In the field, there are 3 small bonhommes with arms dropping or holding small vases. They are dressed in tunics and have large triangular heads. In the field, a cone-shaped milk vessel and a handled bucket completes the scene. A lion walks with a peaceful air, wagging its tail. He is the enemy of the herdsman. Unfortunately, the smiley little space aliens reconstructed in the seal disappear under the hard eye of the modern high-resolution camera, and all we're left with is a partly damaged picture of a tripod or date palm, an altogether not impossible object in what looks like a lineup of offerings. From other seals, it is clear that high-ranking members of the Proto-Elamite society were represented by either lions or bulls, and we may therefore be able to read this seal as a simple representation of offerings of produce, represented by the different vases and baskets in the top register next to the lion, to or by the ruler, represented by the lion, from a specific institution represented by the animals in the lower register. However, this apparent taboo on human representations in art and writing, rare in world history as it may be, remains to be fully explained. We are able to also establish rather firmly the relative chronology of writing during the Proto-Elamite period, with 3 main phases of the Proto-Elamite writing system attested at Susa, and with examples from both the old excavations of Morcan, Jacques de Morcan, and the more recent excavations of Lebrun. We're also able to link these periods to sites across Iran, to find at sites across Iran, and even to use that to suggest different trajectories for the spread of writing across Iran. We also have a fairly good understanding of the death of Proto-Elamite. Proto-Elamite simply disappeared at the end of Susa 14b, and with it writing from Iran for a very long period of time. The gap between Proto-Elamite and the earliest examples of cuneiform in Iran is well over 500 years. The collapse of the Proto-Elamite writing system is of course usually ascribed to a collapse of the society underpinning the writing system, but that may not in fact be correct. If I may skip out from my manuscript for a second, think about today's world. If this had been a different type of pandemic we were living through, say like with the death rates of the Black Death, one could easily imagine that all of the scribes in Susa would have been wiped out in one round of such a pandemic. We can estimate that fewer than 5 or 10 families would have been literate at Susa during this period. When the Susa scribes adopted the Mesopotamian system of writing, they failed to bring with them one perhaps crucial aspect of this new system, namely the scholarly tradition, as I've mentioned, which at all times seems to have gone hand in hand with the often very practical application of writing in Mesopotamia. Contrary, therefore, to Proto-Cuneiform, which developed into cuneiform and thus lived on for more than 3 millennia and did indeed become a communicative system, Proto-Elamite was very short-lived and left no trace in later writing traditions in Iran. The text here and other texts across the corpus show significant systemic errors that may be connected to the lack of standardization stemming from the failure to import school text with the idea of writing. So is this the world's first example of knowledge collapse due to underfunding? It is sometimes claimed, luckily with less and less frequency these days, that Protolamide is somehow a precursor to linear Elamite. However strange this claim is, given the enormous time span between the two writing systems, it is also a sign of, I don't know, there's something is not really working here when people make this claim. If there was a relationship between these two writing systems, we should expect that linear Elamite signs showed the closest resemblance to the latest Proto-Elamite signs, but they do not. In fact, if anything, the linear Elamite signs look like signs from the earlier periods of Proto-Elamite. It would be useful, therefore, if people would also study Proto-Elamite when making those comparisons. So, you may ask us how we know what we know. And that is a perfectly legitimate question. In fact, I think you should ask that of anyone who works on this and related questions. How do people who claim that Uruk texts mention Inanna know that Inanna is mentioned in these texts? How do we know that the sign M346 means a female sheep, and so forth? Basically, we know what we know about Protolamide because we've proven a couple of basic concepts, such as the dependency of Protolamide on protocuneiform, the value of a number of loans, the value of the numerical systems and signs, mostly loaned also from Mesopotamia, and certain organizational principles common in administrative protocuneiform and cuneiform texts from early Mesopotamia. We know, for example, that the idea of writing and the material, including the stylus, were inherited from Mesopotamia. We also know that the two writing systems, protocuneiform and Proto-Elamite, shared a set of basic signs. Just jump back to the issue with the stylus. The only difference between the styli in Mesopotamia and in Iran is that the Iranian scribes used the stylus with a rounded tip for writing the smaller numerical signs, and the scribes in Mesopotamia used the stylus with a flat tip to write the smaller numerical signs. For the bigger numerical signs, they both used one with a flat tip. These are the kind of things that may sound and seem minute and uninteresting, but these are the things you need to consider to fully understand this sort of writing system. So we know that the two writing systems share a set of basic signs, and that these are most likely loaned from Mesopotamia into Iran. For most of these signs, we know their semantic field from the Mesopotamian context, where of course both the lexical tradition and later texts can aid us. And similarly, we know that both signs shared most of the numerical systems, signs, and most of the systems. The signs are almost all written with the same signs in the two systems, and using simple arithmetic, we can establish the numerical relationship between the signs and show the similarity between the two. But why do we think that the Iranian scribes loaned the signs from Mesopotamia and not the other way around? That's a legitimate question to ask. Well, let's look at one set of signs, the signs for male and female workers. And I only show the one for female worker here, but many of you will know the one for male worker. These signs are identical or near identical in the two systems. But whereas it can be argued that at least one of them, the one here, Sal in protocuneiform and M72 in Prodolamide, is independent of any particular writing system, it is simply a graphical representation of the female genitalia. The same cannot be proven for the other sign, Kur A or M388, although it's possible. We can return to that in discussion if anyone is interested. But this is not where the proof of the loan lies. Rather, Sal or M72 stands out in the Proto-Elamite signery, which is fully devoid of any signs that represent the human form or any human body parts. But whereas Sal M72 stands out in Proto-Elamite, it is at home in Protocuneiform, where multiple signs are graphical representations of humans or human body parts, and where humans are frequently depicted in the art. This strongly suggests that this sign and other comparable signs were loaned together from Mesopotamia into Iran, where their meaning, graphical reference, was subsequently lost. But how do we go from knowing the value of a few signs and the numerical signs and systems to having a good overview of the content of the tablets? Well, once we understand the numerical systems, we can suggest and then prove that, like in Mesopotamia, the numerical systems were content dependent. That is, specific systems were used to count specific products, just like we do. We count oil in barrels and eggs in dozens. We don't count chickens in litters or weigh feathers in millimeters. That way, we can expand the knowledge from basic science, from the basic science for barley to various barley products, from the basic science for a herded animal to all animals, and so forth. So what are the main outstanding questions in the decipherment of Proto Elamite? And I think everyone would agree with me that one of the most important outstanding questions is whether Proto Elamite developed a subset of signs used phonetically to write personal names and perhaps other information, and subsequently, of course, to establish the inventory of this subset of the signary and to try and decipher it. I should warn you all first that although there has been talked about a syllabary since the publications of Prodolamide, it is by no means certain that one existed. Whereas it seems clear that a subset of signs that likely refers to individuals or institutions is set apart from the rest of the signary, both graphically and graphotactically, this alone does not prove that it was a syllabary or that these signs coded sound in any way. I have spoken about this supposed syllabary at a number of occasions, and I'm happy to now know that my former student, Kate Kelly, who's now a postdoc at the University of Toronto, and who's here today, who's working with Willis Monroe at the University of British Columbia, and computational linguists at the Simon Fraser University, also in Canada, are making great progress on the composition of this subset of the signary. And I consider their work to be probably the most interesting work on early writing from Iran and possibly from anywhere at the moment. So I mentioned that the subset of signs I set aside both graphically and graphotactically, and let me explain what I mean. An analysis of sign usage in Protolamide will show first a distribution between numerical and non-numerical signs, with a small group of numerical signs functioning also like non-numerical signs. A further investigation of the non-numerical signs will show that some signs are primarily used as object signs, appearing at the end of sign strings, ultimately just before the numerical signs that qualify them. A final segmentation will show that another group of signs tend to appear in first position of longer strings or immediately before object signs in very short strings or as headers of entire transactions. Segmenting out these two groups within the non-numerical signs leaves less than 100 or more than 50 signs that are rarely or never found used in a similar way to the two other groups. These signs appear in groups of 2 to 4 signs, 2 to 4 within longer strings, usually framed by an initial sign coming from the second group described above and concluded by an object sign. They have therefore all the hallmarks of being a syllabary, perhaps not a not yet fully formed syllabary, but still a syllabary. If this conclusion proves right, it would be by far the earliest syllabary anywhere in the world. An incipient syllabary in Mesopotamia is not attested before several hundred years later, in the middle of the 3rd millennium BC. But firsts are not the only claim to fame for this subset of the Protolamide signary. The way the signs were invented may hide a surprise to the students of writing systems. We are usually taught that underlying the invention of phonetic writing is the so-called rebus principle, where a phonetic value of a sign derived from its pictographic one is used to represent a syllable or a word, as in I can see you, drawn with the pictures for an I, a can, the C, and a U. This is certainly the case in Mesopotamia, where the very first attempts at phonetic writing, usually for personal names and to disambiguate multivalent signs, were based on that principle. However, a majority of the Protolamide signs that we speculate recorded sound, the syllabic value signs, do not at all look like anything from which their phonetic value could have been derived. From a graphical point of view, these signs show far less dependence on an identifiable graphical prototype there are very few of these signs that look like anything we can identify. Rather, a majority of these signs appear to be invented without a graphical referent in real life. And it appears then that the rebus principle was not, after all, a driving factor behind the invention of most of the syllabic signs in Proto Elamite. Rather, it seems as if a majority of the signs were invented ad hoc for this purpose only and with no particular graphical referent in mind. Thus, our new knowledge from Proto Elamite challenges some of the ways in which we understand a very basic feature of writing systems. It is only this little subset of the proposed syllabic value signs that have clear graphical referent. And they are either a vessel, an animal head, or more interestingly, a numerical sign. And we can discuss that if there's time afterwards. So let's return to the most important outstanding questions in the study of Proto Elamite. I think we could simply return to the previous task of extending the semantic classes using the numerical systems and other clues. And this has been very fruitful and could continue to be very fruitful in a quest to decipher large numbers of signs in Proto Elamite. There are a number of problems that remains to be solved, and highest on my list, and I've mentioned this at other talks, is the absence of cows. Just as with sheep and goat, where the graphical shape of the signs did not give clue indications, no signs in the sign repertoire can be identified as the picture of a cow or a bull based on the image properties of the sign. So how do we move forward? There are a couple of possibilities. Either the bookkeeping of cows and bulls and the products obtained from herding these animals has not been identified, or the archives have not been found. This may be less likely, as many recovered texts with seals depicting cows and bulls have been found, and it can be shown that occasionally seal iconography and text content overlap, or cows and bulls were herded and eaten and the products were refined, but this was done on a decentralized level, not requiring bookkeeping of the kind used about sheep and goat herding. Now this is interesting because during the much later third dynasty of Ur in southern Mesopotamia, cow herding, of course, was managed much closer than sheep and goat herding, most likely as a result of the movement of the herds. Cows stay, sheep and goat move. I should mention, of course, that archaeological investigations, of course, proves that there's quite a lot of bones of cows and bulls in sites from the Proto-Elamite period. In the course of our work in Tehran, we were made aware of a substantial group of unpublished Proto-Elamite tablets, about 100 in total. 2 of these had been presented in an Iranian language catalog some years earlier, but remained otherwise unstudied. And the remainder were entirely unknown. And they are all said to originate from Susa, something that can be verified through comparisons with the published texts. And I immediately asked for permission to publish these in a collaborative effort together with Sepide Yegane and Simin Tiran. And our work, of course, has now been slowed down by the pandemic, but I still hope we'll finish within 12 months from now. And Simin Tiran will work on the seals, and Sepide Yegane and I will work on the texts. And this will be a traditional volume with copies of all the texts, transliterations, and a full commentary. But we will make all of the raw data available online concurrently with our work on the publication in paper, both to facilitate our collaboration and to strengthen the quality of the publication. Some people here may have suggestions when they see the text, and we will be very happy to hear those, and to ensure maximum openness in the research. Publishing new Proto-Elamite tablets is a lot about managing expectations. If we were talking about later periods in Mesopotamia and we had 100 new texts, we could expect, for example, new literary texts, even previously unknown texts, such as is the case with the privately owned Skøyen collection in Norway. Or we could expect perhaps administrative texts from new centers such as Irisanrik or Garshana, corpora that have changed our understanding of the Ur-3 period. However, new Proto-Cuneiform and Proto-Elamite tablets bring very different expectations, and we know what to expect. And I'd like to say some words about that before I show you a few examples. So what will the new text bring? Firstly, new text will bring more of the same. That's usually the case with any new publication, but particularly so when it comes to early writing systems. But the new text will also bring many new signs and new sign variants, and that has to do with the nature of Proto Elamite. Unlike proto-cuneiform, where we can observe a certain amount of standardization in the signary from the Uruk III period, there were never any attempts at standardizing the signary of Proto Elamite, of the Proto Elamite text. And every new text publication introduces new signs. In my recent publication of 124 tablets from the Louvre Museum, I added 14 previously unattested signs and sign variants. All of these new signs are formed in expected ways, however. So let's start very quickly by looking at this fragmentary text from the National Museum in Iran, 1117, and let's zoom in on a rather difficult text, sign M323B. This sign is very likely to be a new variant of the sign M323I found in the Louvre text that you see on the right, as it occurs in exactly the same type of text and in the exact same sequence of signs, something that is very useful for graphotactical analysis. With more texts from the same site, we can also expect to find texts that are very similar to other texts, and even texts that may once have belonged to the same archive or written by the same scribe. The two texts here, 1148 on the left from the new group, and the text published by Shale more than 100 years ago on the right, are very similarly shaped, have very similar content, and are both sealed with the same scribal design that can be shown to replace seals in certain cases. In the future, we may be able to use this sort of information to assign text to specific signs should we ever need that. Of course, we're in the fortunate situation that almost all Proto-Elamite tablets are kept today in either the Louvre or of Iran in Tehran. New texts may also give us more examples of strings of syllabic signs, new variants of syllabic signs, as mentioned just before, and possibly a few new syllabic signs altogether. This is important for any future proper decipherment work, as in fact the dataset is still not sufficiently large to make any real progress. In the two texts published you see here, we see the same string of signs repeated in a text published by Shale more than 100 years ago on the right, and one unpublished text from the National Museum of Iran on the left. The three signs in question appear in a rather similar sequence of signs, making the comparison more interesting and more useful for future graphotactical studies. New text can also help us identifying products. For example, by giving us more data to calculate the ideal size of containers, such as in this pair of text. Here we can use the new text to help us estimate the volume of certain containers in the text, since the total is preserved in the new text in the National Museum of Iran, where in the very similar text from the Louvre, the total is broken away, and the total is needed to be able to establish the value of the container signs in the obverse. So can we expect anything new? Yes, we are, for example, likely to find new numerical signs and systems. Some numerical systems are only partly understood, as there is not enough evidence. And some very large and very small notations are also so infrequently attested that new signs may change our understanding or add to it. However, it is very unlikely that we find new text formats or better linguistic data. No Rosetta Stone for us, I'm afraid. We can look at this text, one of the two texts previously published in an Iranian language catalog. The third entry here has a numerical notation that does not follow convention. When counting 26 items, the scribe wrote first 2 and 14 signs and then 6 and 1 signs. But instead of placing 3 pairs of N1 after each other, he wrote 3 and 1 signs above each other twice. This is not attested in any other Proto-Elamite tablet, but is perhaps not so surprising given what we know about Proto-Elamite. So let's look at the future directions of the study of Proto-Elamite. So there are two tasks that are ongoing. That is the publication of new texts, and in some sense also the re-edition of old publications. And then the painstaking work of cleaning the corpus. The second, and much more promising, is the use of computational linguistics to understand the corpus and eventually, as a side effect, to clean the corpus. And here I want to show briefly 2 slides prepared by Kate Kelly and Logan Bourne and their working group of scholars in Canada. The first figure here shows Protolamide signs grouped according to visual similarity as measured by a computer vision model which they have trained. Put simply, they show the model a picture of a sign and ask it to tell them the sign's name. As a byproduct of performing this task, the model also learns which signs resemble one another. Signs which look similar according to this model are placed together in the figure. And this could help, for example, with identifying development of signs over the course of the Protolamide writing system, something that we have not yet done well. And on this slide, you see some of the results of another strand of their work. Here, Logan, Kate, Anoop, and Willis group signs according to distributional similarity, whether they are used in a similar context, using what's called a close task. By combining the similarity scores from that model with the similarity scores from the visual model, they can identify pairs of signs with very similar appearance and usage. This lets them predict how likely it is that a given pair of signs are simply graphical variants of one another. One application of this work will be to confirm or potentially call into question my own labeling of sign variants and to determine whether any new variants ought to be proposed and so forth. So with that, thank you very much for your attention.